Hi, babe.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for being interviewed for my class.
Oh, sure. Anytime.
You have been in the background of other videos, so it's
Probably
you're
doing laundry.
you're finally getting your sad card with
Yeah.
this one, right? What I want to start with is as a former educator in Aurora Public Schools, would an 8.5% raise have kept you working for that district? Yes or no? And why is it yes?
If I had only known when I turned in my resignation letter. I think what needs to be understood about APS is they actually do a lot of really difficult work at the administrative level to make really sound financial decisions.
Sure.
Which is why APS was already one of the highest paying districts in the state. If it was just the pay that pulled me to Aurora Public Schools, then it would have been just the pay that
There we go.
kept me.
All right, so I think before we begin, it might be useful for everyone to hear kind of your teaching resume. You're young into your career as we all are, right? So like what your resume is, where you've taught, and what you're up to now.
Sure. I think technically speaking, my teaching resume starts as an undergrad. I was a teaching assistant at an elementary school for my work study, and I worked predominantly with English language development elementary school students, as well as students on IEPs and 504s, so health and behavioral disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And then I, for a summer, taught fourth grade for a school that was to prevent summer slide for underprivileged students in Fort Collins. And then right after I graduated college, we moved out to Wiggins, and I started teaching for Fort Morgan High School.
How excited!
I was a ninth grade English language arts teacher and humanities teacher at Fort Morgan, and then
You got to do something really cool out there, though.
I
Right?
got to do something very, very cool. At the time, Fort Morgan did not have a codified ninth grade curriculum of any subject, so me and the other ninth grade English teacher got to fully design an entire ninth grade curriculum ourselves, which was a really incredible experience. However, we did get a lot of pushback.
Sure.
Her and I did.
Sure.
Which I can go into a different time if you want to. And then I taught at Fort Morgan for a year, and then I went to Aurora Central High School in APS.
Mm-hmm. And then most recently.
So my first year at Central, I taught English language development, level 3 and 4. So those are students who are progressing English acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so their ELD class is really more of just like a support for the English language, as opposed to like they don't know
Teaching
English
them
yet. Yeah. And then after that, my second year, I taught English language arts for 10th graders.
Great, and that I think it's also important to note that spring break of your first full year out in Fort Morgan was when the COVID-19 pandemic started.
March 13th, 2020.
And you taught more than
Friday.
half of your first year in Aurora virtually. Right? Yeah,
yes.
so that was.
Well, actually, technically speaking, my whole first year at Aurora was virtually, but half of it I had to teach online from my classroom.
From your classroom, yes.
Sitting
right.
all alone.
Yes, how excited. We don't want teachers being lazy or anything.
No.
So I think, we talked a lot this week about, motivations of teachers. It's kind of been a focus of our last couple of classes. So, like, what motivated you to be a teacher in the first place?
Really what motivated me to be a teacher in the first place was the role that other teachers had played in my life. Growing up, I did not have a safe or necessarily welcoming household. And there was a lot of uncertainty and volatility in my household growing up. But I always had really excellent teachers who really cared about me and really took a vested interest in me. And they had all of my older sisters, and so it felt like if I couldn't find the love at home, I could always find it at school. So originally I wanted to be a music teacher.
Yes.
I went a year and a half of college going through music education classes, and then realized you actually have to learn and be proficient in all the instruments.
Oh, yeah. They don't just let you play your bass clarinet all the time.
No, you can't just choose one and go with it. So I was like, I actually just love my instrument. I don't love the others. But I loved English, and I loved the global connections you can make through language arts, and so I redirected towards that, which helped because the two groups of teachers I had that I loved and felt loved me the most were my music teachers and my English teachers.
Yeah. Could you also talk a little bit about your experience as a Native American woman as well? I know that was important.
Yeah, so I am indigenous from the Cherokee Nation, or I do identify that way, and I grew up northern Colorado Springs, and my dad had just retired from the Air Force when I was going up in school, and so where we landed in Colorado Springs is very predominantly white. Very predominantly affluent and conservative. And even though I am white passing, you talk about the family tree project in 3rd grade, and then kids don't really necessarily understand that, and then they ask their parents, and it just gets around. So I grew up being called the token Indian, or the token Native American. And that was really hurtful, because then it was like this cultural identity that I'm still trying to navigate in this very white predominant world is now being bandied against me, which also did help with, I couldn't necessarily always find that support at home, but I always had a lot of teachers that helped with that, or at least gave an ear to talk about it with. And I think that's really the biggest thing, is never having felt small by a teacher, which I know many students do actually feel small by teachers, which is heartbreaking and unfortunate. But in my specific circumstance, I always felt if I could give that same, that beam of light that a student feels when they feel seen, I always wanted to give that to as many students as I could.
I call it your stand and deliver mentality, right? Where you want the "oh captain, my captain" moment for your students, right?
I don't want them to do that to me.
No, no, and I think that all that's really great, and I would love to just talk about that. But unfortunately, I am teaching ed policy, which is way more depressing.
Yes.
And so. The reason why I wanted to talk to you specifically is that you recently made a really difficult decision to leave the classroom. So tell me a little bit about your decision, what you're going into, and kind of what were the push factors that drove you away from the classroom.
Sure. So on the top tier level, I am taking 2 years off from teaching in the classroom to pursue a master's in English education, as well as a focus in pedagogy and curriculum design. And then getting deeper into that, I think the past 3 years have been incredibly difficult for everyone in the service industry, regardless of what that service is. If you are in a position where you are serving others, the past 3 years have been incredibly difficult. And truly, you cannot understand how difficult it is unless you are in the service field. And so, being in the education field and serving students, having the school shut down halfway through the school year, and students being thrown into online school, and then being told that like the world is shutting down and we need to have grace and we need to give this to students, and then they come back to school and then all of a sudden there's no grace for them and our kids are 2 years behind and we don't understand why these kids can't succeed. And then in my personal experience this past school year I had 4 students pass away. Their Central faced a lot of violence at the school, on school grounds. I was also sexually harassed at work, which wasn't fun, to say the least. So ultimately there was a lot that just built up, and I got to the point where I'm not a quiet person. I'm pretty vocal. The reason I left Fort Morgan in the first place was because I had gotten to the hill I was willing to die on, which was anti-racism, and the school said we would metaphorically rather kill you than see you get to the top of this hill. So I left that school. So I was very vocal at Central as well, as is my nature, and combating these ideas of having rigorous education, yes, but also equitable and accessible education for students that are 2 years behind, not because they're lazy, but because the world shut down. And on top of that, at the school I was teaching at specifically, that these students are growing up, most of them from birth to high school, but for a lot of them as well from entrance into the United States up to that point that, all of them are low lives, drug addicts, gang members, good for nothings. And if you tell a kid that enough times, then they will internalize that. And so I was getting really frustrated with the conflict of we serve every student every day, and yet we are glossing over big swaths of pain and trauma in order to just push kids out of this slide that they had experienced during COVID.
When you talk about the rhetoric of the way that people are talking about both you as a teacher, but also your students that you're serving, who were the main people propagating that rhetoric, and was it ever directed directly at you and directly at your students, or was it more of a general kind of feeling overall?
In regards to specifically,
like their low lives, they're not succeeding, you left the grace away.
I think Aurora Public Schools at large, but from my experience, Central specifically, has historically had an issue with that. You also, there needs to be a big appreciation for the fact that downtown Denver is like 20 minutes away from Central. So our direct immediate neighborhood faced a lot of gentrification in a relatively short amount of time. And it kind of pushed our students out into the peripheries. And so you have a lot of pretty, I wouldn't say necessarily affluent, but probably middle class, but compared to a lot of our students, very affluent people, telling them oh, these kids, they just, they run around and they do crazy stuff and they don't care. And Central has really always had that problem since they were no longer the only high school in the district. So for 30 plus years, our reputation has just been going down, and then eventually 8 years ago, they were failing to the point where they hit turnaround status. And I think instead of that being a punch in the gut for a lot of the admin of okay, so how are we actually instilling community in our students so that the community can be involved in our students' education. Instead, it was this big revamp of okay, well, how can we get our students to pass then?
Sure.
is really what the mentality is. And I think it's highly complicated as well, because ingrained in all of this is just inherent racism. And just inherent barriers to 98% of our students that identify as
for sure.
a minority population.
Yeah, I think that's really good, and I think that your experience in Aurora specifically is really informative for, we've talked a lot about the unequal effects of our education policies, and that these highly urban, these highly rural districts, of which you've worked in now, one of each, right? That they're getting the brunt of a lot of these issues. And Aurora, I think, benefits from its size in a lot of ways, that they're able to make those financially sound decisions, but they still face those same issues.
I do think also something to note with that is that APS can and should be, to an extent, praised for, at least at the highest administrative level, for actions they have taken to be financially sound and to be able to give raises to their teachers. I think it is also an interesting thought challenging to think about, what aren't they giving that additional funding to?
Yeah, that $30 million, it could have gone elsewhere too. And I think that, one of the arguments I made with this week's video lecture was like, cool, the raise is fun, but if you're still being sexually harassed, if your students are still lying, if you're still facing that constant racism on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't matter how much they're paying you. It's a toxic work environment.
Yes.
So
I would have loved to have enough seats in my classroom for every single student.
Let's start there.
Honestly, before a raise, at the very least.
Excellent. So with your perspective, you're also married to someone who does nothing but yell about politicians all the time. So it's exhausting. I get that. In your opinion, from where you sit, what don't policymakers know about teachers? What don't they understand about teachers, and what do you want them to understand about teachers?
I think there's quite a bit that policymakers don't understand about teachers. I think first and foremost is that students aren't policy, that students are young adults, students are children, students are individuals.
They're complex.
Yes, yeah, and so a lot of the big approach to a lot of education policy is that because we have seen general trends of decline, we need to make general policies for incline, which then takes away from what students are actually going through, who students actually are, the multifaceted views of community, where students are coming from, where they have been. It truly, in the truest sense, begins to whitewash students across the nation. And then I think another thing that policymakers should understand about teachers is that schools decline teachers leave schools not because of who they are, but because of how the school treats them.
Yeah.
Whether that's and I'm include the school community, whether that's feeling like the community at large, the school included, is driving you out, or if it's admin, if it's other teachers. Teachers go into teaching for students. Even teachers who go through alternative licensing, they're aware that every day they are going to be interacting with hundreds of students. And so if all it was the students, teachers would never leave.
Sure.
But it's not that. It's taking away agency from teachers. It's taking away it's really taking away knowledge from students when we whitewash our policy and whitewash our education. We standardize our students, and that takes away from the complexity of how much progress these students could be making and what change they could be making for the world around them.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think that's very well said. One of the things that I think it's most frustrating for me when I'm doing research on this sort of stuff is the amount of detail, color, everything that you bring from your experiences in the classroom, and then I go and I'm reading about Colorado state funding formula, and it's like, okay, what 4 boxes do those students fit into?
Yeah.
You know, and those boxes are never how hungry were they when they took that test? What sort of abuse do they experience at home, at school, in the community? You know, that sort of stuff. And I think that, you know, policymakers at large oversimplify a lot of things, and I think that that has been to the detriment of our teachers. My final question is that, you know, we're facing this teacher shortage, and I think that there is a lot of disingenuous arguments saying that teachers are to blame for this teacher shortage, that people like you're giving up on those kids, and I that's objectively just not true. It really is a more holistic understanding of what the work environment has come to, and that teachers have put up with a lot for a long time, and now they're just done. And so, for you, if you got to wave a magic wand and fits schools and teaching as a profession to fits the work environment to help stop this teaching shortage, what sort of things would you want to do? Is it an 8.6% raise? Is it just the 0.1%, or
Quick segue. What if, instead of giving, I mean, teachers need a raise, obviously, but in Aurora's case, I mean, I got essentially a $10,000 raise going from Fort Morgan to Aurora, which was huge. I also would have liked more classroom materials that I didn't have to buy myself. I would have liked to not have to buy my own classroom books and my own bookshelves, and I would have liked to not have to go to Walmart and get a really crappy plastic chair, a set of 5 that I laid out in my classroom because we literally didn't have enough desks. I would have liked to not teach in a mobile that has gun holes in it.
No kidding, right?
I would have liked to not have to use an overhead projector. Like there's things that I would have liked for our dean to not have his office renovated 3 times in 2 years. Like there's a lot more that this money could be going towards, and I think the hard part is that classroom environments are barely functioning because teachers have to create it. And so if policy and administrators focused more on creating the environment and let teachers who are specifically trained to teach the whole student, then I think that balance would be really excellent. Because right now, as you were saying in your previous video, education only exists because of teachers right now. And teachers are teaching and creating the education platforms and creating the environments, and also caring for these students for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And then on top of that, there's administrators coming back saying, well, why didn't you do this in your classroom? Why don't you have these posters in your classrooms? What if you just bought a couple more books like this? And it just once again gets put on the teachers over and over again. And at the most basic understanding, administrators are there to manage. And
to
so
administer.
Administrate. They should manage the environment that is necessary for the community so that teachers can teach the students as the individuals that they are. I think a big part of that is that a lot of, this kind of like new age approach to teaching, or this like more prevalent pedagogical practices, is really focusing on teaching students as individuals and building them up, but that takes a lot. You know, think about how much a parent needs to raise one child. Now think about how much a teacher needs to support 40 kids 8 hours a day, 5 days a week.
My final question, this has all been excellent. My final question is, what are you indoctrinating our children with, and why are you ruining our society?
I am ruining our society. I'm going to start backwards. I'm ruining our society because I think it's important for students to love and appreciate something so much that they're willing to fight to make it better. And so that's how I'm ruining our society, is by telling kids to make it better.
Excellent.
Change,
excellent.
people.
and all through critical race theory, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And how I'm indoctrinating our students is, honestly, I am every parent's nightmare probably, because I'm like, if something doesn't make sense, you should question it. If something doesn't sound fair, you should question it. I also have the benefit of teaching 15-year-olds, so I feel like at that point they're like, yeah, I can question it. They're a little bit more discerning than maybe an 8-year-old might be. But that's what I'm indoctrinating our students with, is to constantly be asking questions to make that change.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you for taking some time to talk to me. I will make sure that we have many teachers in our in the class that have echoed a lot of your experiences, and so I hope it's validating for you, and I hope that your story is validating and informative for them as well. So I want to thank you.
Of course. Thank you.